All right, buckle up, everybody. Today, we are diving deep, deep, deep into JFK's foreign policy. We're talking Cold War, we're talking presidential pressure, we're talking some real historical intrigue.
Yeah, and we are going way beyond just, skimming the surface here. We're relying on this YouTube documentary. It's called JFK, A President Betrayed. It's not just about what happened, but why should we care today?
Exactly. We're trying to figure out, the man behind the myth, right?
Yeah.
And you know me, I love uncovering some hidden truths. So what's the first bombshell from this documentary? What's something that really stood out?
Well, it really paints this picture of Kennedy as a president, just thrown into the deep end with this whole Cold War thing, and now facing pressure from all sides, learning on the job, having to question absolutely everything.
Yeah, the documentary really focuses on the Bay of Pigs invasion as this big turning point for him. You really get the sense that whole thing really messed him up.
Oh, absolutely. The Bay of Pigs, for those who maybe haven't heard of it, it was this failed CIA-backed attempt to overthrow Fidel Castro in Cuba back in 1961. And the documentary really seems to argue that this event, JFK authorized it based on bad intel, and it completely shattered his trust in his advisors. Just imagine inheriting a plan like that and having it blow up in your face so publicly.
Oh, talk about a way to start your presidency.
Okay.
It makes you wonder how anybody could come back from something like that.
Right. And the thing is, what I think is so fascinating is how he did. He became so wary of what they call hawkish advice. Basically those advisors pushing for all this aggressive military action. He basically started to question everything after that.
Yeah. It's like they told him, hey, just trust us on this whole Cuba thing, and it just blew up in his face.
Totally. And you know what? The documentary even suggests that he considered breaking up the CIA after that. That gives you a sense of just how deeply this impacted him. I mean, Think about it. Dismantling the CIA, the agency that's supposed to be gathering all the intelligence, protecting the nation, it's huge.
Wow. Okay, so we got a president who's super skeptical of his own advisors, trying to handle this crazy global standoff with the Soviet Union. And then on top of that, he has to deal with Khrushchev.
Yeah, and Khrushchev was not an easy guy to deal with, that's for sure. I mean, the documentary does make him out to be kind of a bully. He was known for his aggressive tactics, that's for sure. But at the same time, it does acknowledge that Khrushchev understood what was at stake, with nuclear war and all that. He wasn't just messing around. It was a very calculated performance.
Like a high-stakes poker game with the whole world on the line.
Yeah.
And the documentary really emphasizes those stakes when it gets to the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Absolutely. That was one of those moments where the world really did come close to ending. I mean, this is 1962, and they discover these Soviet missiles in Cuba, and things could have very easily turned into a full-blown nuclear war.
And the documentary even talks about this secret plan for a U.S. first strike, one that JFK actually ended up rejecting.
Yeah.
Really makes you wonder what was going through his head at that moment.
Right. And this is where the documentary really starts to challenge the simplistic image of JFK as just another Cold Warrior. I mean, here he is presented with this incredibly aggressive option, this preemptive nuclear strike, and he says no.
Man, that takes some serious guts to resist that kind of pressure.
Oh, absolutely. It makes his legacy all the more complicated, right? You've got this guy dealing with this crazy global tension, but at the same time, he's trying to find a peaceful way out. He's not just reacting to what Khrushchev is throwing at him. He's trying to find a different path entirely.
Makes you think about that famous quote of his, right? How did it go? Something like, mankind must put an end to war before war puts an end to mankind.
Exactly. And this whole idea of finding a diplomatic solution, it wasn't just limited to the Soviets. The documentary talks about some lesser-known aspects of JFK's foreign policy, too, like his stance on Vietnam and even, get this, his attempts to actually negotiate with Castro.
Whoa, hold on. Negotiate with Castro. I thought those two were sworn enemies after the whole Bay of Pigs thing.
Right. And that's what's so interesting about all of this. It seems like JFK, having been burned by his own advisors during the Bay of Pigs, he started to rely more on these unofficial channels, these back channels, more personal diplomacy. It was like he understood the limits of traditional foreign policy, especially with all the craziness of the Cold War.
So he was like a Cold War maverick or something, working behind the scenes, trying to cool things down.
In a way, yeah. And get this, The documentary even highlights the secret attempt to actually start a dialogue with Castro. They suggest that he was using this French journalist, Jean Daniel, as a go-between, carrying messages back and forth to Havana.
No way. That's like something straight out of a spy movie.
And it gets even crazier. So get this, Daniel is actually with Castro when the news of JFK's assassination breaks.
Are you serious? You can't make this stuff up. What did Castro say?
So the documentary, it describes this really powerful moment. Daniel's there telling Castro about Kennedy's message, this offer for negotiation, and right then somebody rushes in with the news from Dallas.
Oh, man. It's like this fragile hope for peace just shattered right then and there.
Yeah.
It really makes you think, though, what if JFK had lived?
Right. Would he have actually been able to pull off this rapprochement with Cuba?
And what about Vietnam? I mean, the documentary mentioned that JFK had his doubts about the U.S. getting involved there, too, right?
Exactly, and this is where his own personal history really comes into play. So JFK, he actually traveled to Vietnam back in 1951. He saw firsthand what the French were up against with the Viet Minh. And this experience, according to the documentary at least, it gave him this much deeper understanding of how complex the situation in Vietnam really was, much more so than many of his advisors who were looking at it through this Cold War lens.
So he had this firsthand knowledge that made him really question their whole domino theory idea.
Yeah, and his skepticism early on it's well documented. The documentary actually includes this audio clip from an interview from 1954 where he's basically arguing against the U.S. getting involved in Vietnam. He says that, without the support of the Vietnamese people, any intervention it's doomed to fail.
Man, that's some serious foresight right there. He saw the writing on the wall way back then. But what about the pressure he must have been getting from the military to escalate things? Didn't we already have military advisors in Vietnam by then?
We did. But, and here's the kicker. The documentary, they found this document, this National Security Action Memorandum from October 1963, just weeks before JFK was assassinated, and it seems to outline a plan to withdraw those advisors by 1965.
Wait, seriously? He was planning to pull out completely?
That seems to be the case.
Man, that changes everything. I mean, that totally goes against everything we think we know about JFK as this cold warrior. It's like he's got this public image, but then behind closed doors, he's trying to end the arms race. He's trying to make a deal with Castro, and he's trying to get the U.S. out of Vietnam. That paints a totally different picture of the guy.
Doesn't it? And it raises so many questions. Like, if he had lived, could he have actually done it? Or would the advisors, the military, the powers that be, would they have just shut him down?
Man, who knows? But this whole thing just makes you realize how much can really ride on one person, and how close we can come to things being completely different.
Really makes you think, like, what if? What if things had gone differently that day in Dallas? What if that motorcade had made a different turn? What if he had lived, what then?
It's crazy to think about, right? Like, how different could the world be today? This documentary, it really paints this picture of JFK as this guy who's really wrestling with these massive issues, trying to, steer the country, steer the whole world in a different direction, towards peace.
And having to deal with all this resistance, right? From his own government, no less. You got to think about that. The internal battles, the strategies. I mean, it makes you question everything you thought you knew about the guy,
Totally. I mean, we always put these historical figures up on these pedestals. But this documentary, it shows you the human side of it, the struggles, the decisions. He wasn't just this icon. He was a guy trying to make impossible choices.
Yeah, and that's what makes these deep dives so interesting, right? It's not just about JFK's foreign policy or whatever. It's about leadership. And the weight of those decisions, the impact that one person can have.
Totally. It reminds you that, like, history, it's not always so black and white, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
We try to simplify it, but the reality is always way more complicated.
Yeah.
Way more interesting, too.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's always more to learn, right? More perspectives. What really stood out to you from all this?
Honestly. Just how bold he was. Like, this wasn't some passive president just reacting to stuff. He was out there trying to change the whole game. The whole Cold War, even if it meant going up against his own people.
Right. Like, real leadership isn't about just going with the flow. It's about having the guts to do what you think is right, even when it's hard, even when it's unpopular.
Well said. Well said.
Yeah.
I've got to say, this deep dive has given me a whole new perspective on JFK. That's for sure. It's like a good reminder that history is never really over. There's always something new to discover.
Exactly. And that's what's so great about, digging into history like this, we learn about the past, sure, but we also learn about ourselves, about the challenges we're facing today, and about how important it is to think for yourself.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Well, folks, it seems like we've reached the end of our deep dive for today. But I gotta say, it feels like the conversation's just getting started. This documentary has given me a lot to think about, that's for sure.
As always, the best conversations leave you with more questions than answers, right? So what will you be exploring further based on what we talked about today?